"It's here," announced Amanda. "Ombidou Gigi," said John Paul. "Pardon?" He opened his eyes with jungle swiftness and rolled over to face his wife. The date was July 5th, and the Zillers had slept quite late, having on the previous day entertained hundreds more customers than normal and dispensed a record number of hot dogs. "It has arrived," said Amanda. "I can feel it." She bounced from bed and was halfway down the stairs, trailing her silver robe behind her, when she met Mark's Marvelous. Had it not been for the item he was fetching, had it not been for the charisma of the letter in his paw, Marvelous surely would have seized her. Seeing her nude for the first time, and seeing her obvious pleasure at being seen, Bronco desire bucked again into his glands. Yippee! Sexuality ringed Amanda the way a penumbra rings a shadow. She became aware of his checkered erection in the manner that Salvador Dali became aware of the rhinoceros horn, calling it the perfect logarithmic spiral. She longed to collar it with her fingers, but when she reached out for it, Marvelous extended the letter and her hand closed on it instead. In the outer circle of postmark were the words, Città del Vaticano. The stamp bore the inscription, Poste Vaticane. The handwriting was the moral imprint of L. Westminster Plucky Purcell. Leaving poor Mark's Marvelous alone on the steps with his heart on, Amanda dashed back to the bedroom. "It is here," she said. "I knew it had arrived." She tossed the letter onto the bed. "Read it to me while I dress." "So, Brother Dallas has contacted us at long last," said Ziller calmly. He slit the envelope with a fingernail and spread its contents on the bedspread before him, the way a soothsayer might spread the entrails of a fowl. "Wait," said Amanda, pulling on her panties. "I'll call Mark's Marvelous. You can read it to him as well." She did, and he did. And this is how it went. "Dear faraway friends, as you no doubt have determined, I am writing from the Vatican. Ho-hum, what can I say? I took one look at this place and surrendered, just gave up. What earthly difference could it make whether my ambition was to help destroy the church or help reform it? Can you imagine an ant trying to decide whether to remodel Chicago or tear it down? It's the same. If only you had been permitted to write and alert me to the delusions I was suffering. From the air, Vatican City looked like a marble monopoly set. The church owned all the property from Boardwalk to Illinois Avenue, had 3 hotels on every lot, and no matter how often it tossed the dice, you knew it would never land on go to jail. It would be forever passing go and collecting $200. From the air, Vatican City looked also like a street dance to which the libraries of New York and Philadelphia had been exclusively invited. These sooty old neoclassical stone depositories paired off in dignified promenade, too stiff anymore to swing their partners, their voices too hollow with centuries of library hush to manage even the most perfunctory do-si-do. Vatican City looked like a Disneyland for zombies, and it looked like a drag. Later I stood in St. Peter's Square with the enormous old basilica bell donging above me and the pageantry breaking in, velvet waves around me, and somewhere in the jeweled bowels of the castle, the Pope reading the Italian edition of the Wall Street Journal while eating caviar with a golden fork. And I surrendered. What's the use? A guy might see possibilities of effective action when he is up against a small band of ecclesiastical Nazis in Wildcat Creek Monastery, but here at the Home Office, well, it's just too big and too wealthy and too entrenched and too powerful. Why bother? Maybe shooting peas at the sun is someone's idea of a fine poetic gesture, but it's a bore to me. So the Roman Catholic Church is out to Catholicize the world. What of it? Communism is out to communize the world, and capitalism is out to capitalize the world. Let them fight it out among themselves. I've got to live, and I can't be bothered. Now that I think about it, I guess that has been your philosophy all along. Oh well, I'm too slow to learn. At any rate, it's one hell of a grand joke, me being here, me working at the Vatican in an official and privileged position. So I decided I'd just relax and enjoy the joke and play it for all it's worth. A couple of days after I arrived, however, I did discover something that inspired a final twitch of hope that proved to me the church was not entirely invulnerable. It wasn't the court of law or the jail that sits right off St. Peter's Square. Although I didn't realize that the Vatican maintained those institutions, I guess I've associated courts and jails with churches for so long that the presence of them at the Holy See didn't come as any great surprise. No, the real chink in the churchly armor is something else. It's the time clocks. In 1956, 40 time clocks were installed in Vatican offices. Today there are about 60. The official explanation of the time control system was that it was, quote, to end late arrivals and early departures by staff members of Vatican bureaus and to regulate absences, end quote. The only dudes who are exempt from punching in and out are, according to the handbook, quote, the cardinal secretaries of congregations, the episcopal heads of other offices, and the Swiss Guard, end quote. Of course, the Felicitate brothers are also exempt, but then we aren't publicly acknowledged as an existing order. Now I ask you, when a religion has to make its own priests punch a time clock, when it so much admits that its own oath-bound holy fathers have been sneaking off the job early, coming in late, and playing hooky, wouldn't you say that that religion has a soft white underbelly? Can you imagine Jesus punching a clock? If he had, would it have prevented his, quote, early departure, end quote? They claim their church is built on a rock, but it looks to me like its foundation isn't all that solid. I mean, show me a religion with time clocks, and I'll show you a religion that has shot its spiritual wad. Give me a long enough lever and a place to stand, and I'll topple it. Purcell won't have to topple it, interrupted Marx Marvelous. It obviously isn't toppling on its own accord. So far, no one has handed me a crowbar or shown me a spot to push, and I'm not really expecting to budge this colossus. But every time I pass one of those clocks, I smile with a confronting knowledge that God's biggest billy club has a crack in it. Things are changing here at the Home Office, and a lot of my brothers are shocked. But I don't know whether the changes are for the better or worse. For one thing, the Pope is toning down the pomp. Not long ago, he ordered cardinals, bishops, and monsignors to prune much of the regal splendor from their dress. He threw out red shoes, silver shoe buckles, galeron hats, sashes, tassels, capes, and ermine-trimmed cloaks. His instructions also allow the title Monsignor to be used in addressing a cardinal or a bishop instead of Eminence or Excellency. The result is things aren't as fancy around here as they used to be. However, they are still far from plain. There is gold everywhere, and silver, and precious gems, and long limousines, and valuable art. They could unload just a third of this treasure and feed every hungry mouth in Europe for the rest of the century. And you may have noticed the Pope didn't cut any of the frills from his personal wardrobe. A couple years back, a papal decree was issued to clean up the roster of venerable saints. More than 40 of the dudes were dropped from the liturgical calendar, mostly because they never existed in the first place, but were merely the invention of fanatics and souvenir salesmen. Among those that got the axe was St. Christopher, the blessed buddy of cruise ship Casanovas, astronauts, and six-day bicycle racers. Scuttlebutt down in the catacombs is that a lot of powerful Catholics, including those responsible for the Society of the Felicitator, are unhappy about those reforms. However, the word is the Pope had to enact them because criticism of ostentation and hypocrisy in the Church has grown so voracious. At this point, Marx Marvelous intruded again to contend that such reforms were desperate last-ditch efforts to revive a dying institution. Amanda, who was pinning violets in her hair, silenced Marx with a special look. Sometimes our scientist friend gets carried away. Here I am, scribbling 100 words a minute about internal problems of the Catholic Church, and you guys probably couldn't care less. Sorry if I'm boring you, but, ever since the freak accident that turned me into Brother Dallas, I found myself getting hung up on churchly matters. It'll pass. I keep telling myself that it'll pass. Someday I'll be a plucky dope dealer again, ministering to my own stoned flock. Meanwhile, I'm enjoying a unique position, a job shared by no living soul on this planet. Assuming that you've got at least a pea pot of curiosity about it, I'll scribble on. Up until several years ago, the Vatican maintained 4 branches of military or police, 4 known branches, that is. Don't forget the undercover felicitators. 3 of these corps, the Palatine Guard, the Noble Guard, and the Gendarmerie, were flat-out law and order badasses. They protected the security of the Holy See with rifles, revolvers, cannon, machine guns, and other tools of the trade. If an appreciable number of Catholics saw anything incongruous about a religious mission bristling with weapons, they pretended that cannon were cannon and didn't let on. Until just recently. Then all of a sudden, the implications of holy police were being discussed so widely that the Pope, to head off further dissent, was forced to make his most drastic reform to date. With a well-timed sweep of his ringed fingers, he disbanded the Palatine Guard, Noble Guard, and Gendarmerie. In so doing, he increased the power and presence of the Felicitate Society, whereas once we were mainly troubleshooters abroad, we now swarm in the shadow of the Golden Throne itself. The smiling jerk who mixes your chocolate sundae in the Vatican soda shop may be a master of poisons. The same 007 who slipped Adlai Stevenson his London heart attack pill. The enthralled tourist you see grinding his movie camera at the gate of St. Anne may be photographing potential troublemakers for closed-circuit TV. I write, quote, may, unquote, because I myself don't really know. All I know is my job here, and my job is involved with that military corps that the Pope did not dissolve, the ancient and colorful Swiss Guard. The 56 dudes in the Swiss Guard strut around the pantaloons and leggings of blue, red, and yellow, silver breastplates, and medieval helmets. They are armed only with 15th century halberds, which are long pole-like weapons with axe blades and spiked points. As you must have gathered, they are mainly a showpiece, or they were. Since all other papal soldiers have been fired, and since the Felicitate Society, however strong in its presence, must work in secrecy, not only from the public, but from most Vaticanians as well, the burden of defending Vatican City has fallen hard on the fancy shoulders of these overgrown Swiss choir boys. Now, with dissension so rapid within the Church today, and with outside opposition stronger than it had been in decades, the Pope and his pals are theoretically in unusual danger. On a visit to Asia last year, the Pope required a security force 12,000 strong, and even then he was almost assassinated in Manila. The threat of demonstrations of one sort or another is constant. So it is conceivable that the Swiss Guard will be seeing action soon, even if that action consists only of clearing St. Peter's Square of sit-in protesters. Imagine how messy it would look in the press and in the eyes of pilgrims and tourists if these favorite picturesque toy soldiers are forced to go hacking and stabbing with their almost comical Renaissance halberds. It would seem especially nasty if the victims of the poleaxes were nonviolent demonstrators. How much clearer and quieter it would be if, with a few quick, almost unobtrusive hand motions, a Swiss guardsman could snap a spine or shut tight a throat. Maintain the old decorum with a minimum of blood and fuss. It is toward that end that the Swiss Guard is learning karate. Yours truly is its honorable mentor. I live in a cell just off the karate training room 2 levels down in the restricted catacombs. I'm adjacent to the College of Cardinals private rifle range and directly below the VIP cafeteria where Gurdjieff once shared a pizza with Mary Baker Eddy. Below me, the 3rd level catacombs are really top secret, but as an agent of Felicitate, I have pretty much the run of the place. I can get into areas where even the Swiss Guard is not allowed. While trying not to arouse suspicions, I have been poking around in the various bedrock chambers down here at every opportunity. Following are listed some of my more interesting discoveries. 1. Exotic art. Naturally, I list this first. Drool, drool. There are stacks and stacks of paintings and squads of sculptures salted away down here. Many are in exile from public perception merely because they depict men and women in their birthday suits, but some have come by their banishment more deservingly. There is a magnificent Rembrandt, for example, that portrays a couple bawling in a hayfield. I sneeze and scratch with vicarious pleasure just to glance at it. 2. Dead Sea Scrolls. As I understand it, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were unearthed in the late 40s and early 50s, some were purchased by Hebrew University, others by the Archbishop of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem. The Archbishop, a Catholic natch, later sold his scrolls to Hebrew University. Does Hebrew have a football team, or aren't they allowed to play with pigskin? But evidently not before culling those which might contradict traditional religious beliefs or embarrass Catholic dogma. Moreover, some of the Hebrew scrolls were processed at the Vatican Library, where additional editing might have taken place. Hidden in the catacombs, along with other old manuscripts and documents that for one reason or another must be too dangerous for inclusion in the 500,000 volume Vatican Library, are Dead Sea fragments whose contents are a mystery to all but a powerful few. These mysterious documents are guarded day and night by a quartet of blind nuns who know them only by touch. 3. Pharmaceutical taboos. Since Catholic missionaries often were the first white men to have contact with primitive cultures, particularly in Africa and the New World, they were in an excellent position to examine, unhampered by scientific proponents of free inquiry, the folk medicines and drug sacraments employed by various tribes. In the process, they concealed a great deal of pharmaceutical information and were able in some cases to scare the natives into abandoning use of natural drugs. I have found in the catacomb drum room samples of peyote, yaji, and psilocybic mushrooms, along with documents dating from 1510 describing their, quote, demonic, unquote, effects, plus countless jars of other blacklisted botanical materials containing God knows what lightning-flavored molecules, offering God knows what incredible insights and flashes, oh baby. My mind sputters to consider it. Also locked up in the chamber of the pharmacological subversives are native contraception potions, any or all of which might be safer and more effective than the pill. Medical science knows nothing of them. Guess why they were suppressed? 4. Easter Island plaques. When the first white explorers landed on Easter Island, each of the giant stoneheads there had at its base an inscribed plaque that presumably explained the significance of the statue. It is widely documented that French Catholic priests destroyed these plaques, for what reason we may only surmise, thereby depriving science of the essential keys in the most stupendous of anthropological enigmas. Who knows what an Easter Island plaque might have revealed about the Stoneheads, the mysterious people who built them, about the origins of man. All of the plaques were not destroyed, however, for there are 3 or 4 of them locked up here, totems, fetishes, and other primitive knickknacks in a dusty chamber. Wish I could smuggle one out to the experts at the Laboratory of Obsolete Impulses, because the alphabet used in inscribing the plaques is totally unfamiliar to me, except that, come to think of it, it does resemble fairly closely that faint writing on the palm of Amanda's hand. There are additional catacomb chambers through whose barred doorways I can detect the nasty evil glitter of silver and gold, and there is at least one room that is permanently sealed. I'm going to continue my snooping. Should I come across any startling stashes, I'll inform you in my next letter. Meanwhile, pray that my employers don't learn that I'm not Brother Dallas, because that old Vatican jailhouse looks as mean as any I've seen in the doglands of Mexico. Oh yes, while I think of it, John Paul, Our mutual acquaintance, George O. Supper, has a studio not far from here. George is the first pop artist to win the Prix de Rome, and he'll be in Italy all summer. Sunday I'm going to slip into my civilian spy suit and pay him a call. George should have a lot of gossip about the New York art crowd, and maybe he'll have the grace to direct me to a good whorehouse. Happy zookeeping, and don't forget those prayers. Yours in his holy name, Plucky P. Marx Marvelous was beside himself. Double redheaded, wow. Purcell's letter he took as a personal triumph, an academic accolade long overdue. It offered further proof, did it not, that the largest church in Christendom has been stilt walking over quicksand for ages? Now Marvelous, having been recently engaged in religious research, was, even prior to the reading of Plucky's Wildcat Creek epistles, informed of the black side of churchly history. He was not ignorant of a single purge. No conquest, no Vatican intrigue had escaped his notice. But the comparative trifles that the mad Pluck exposed seemed so instant, so direct, that they excited him as secondary historical sources never could. The indiscretions itemized by Purcell were, so it seemed to Marvelous, indications of his increasing Christian entropy. To wit, Christianity has gradually lost spiritual energy over the centuries, only to replace it with political and economic energy. That imbalance has warped the religious structure, and although it has heightened its physical force, it has pushed its spiritual potential toward zero. Political and or economic power create the frictional resistance to the natural flow of love. In the case of the church, such friction has resulted in an engine that has considerable momentum but fails to generate salvation. Yes, Purcell's findings did a lot to bolster Marx's theory and awarded the dropout thinker new hopes for the successful projection of future religious systems. On and on. Marvelous jabbered about it, jabbering to John Paul as the magician tied his loincloth, jabbering to Amanda until he noticed the big green tears in her eyes. Had Purcell's disclosures upset her? Poor angel. Had Marx's interpretations, underscoring as they did the decadence of our religious heritage, depressed her? No, it wasn't that. While looking out the bedroom window, Amanda had spotted, just below the southern nub of the giant benevolent weenie, a monarch butterfly, the first she'd seen in a year. Can we, with a straight face, regard it as an omen? I understand, said Marx Marvelous, that as far as you are concerned, the most important thing in life is style. Amanda sighed. She was being challenged again. Worse, her Wednesday bread baking was being interrupted. As usual, she forgave the intrusion. Marx Marvelous is in the process of shedding values, she reasoned. And as the old values are discarded, his mind moves him closer and closer to questions of absolute meaning. She preferred to think that was the case, rather than Marx Marvelous was simply another intellectual tight-ass smugly ripping at every cosmic curtain to expose the specter of dark feminine, irrational mysticism that he is certain lurks behind it. She preferred not to link her zoo manager with those Time magazine types who regard every transcendental experience as some sort of Halloween prank, but who grow as unctuous as sperm whales when they run into a bishop at a cocktail party. Speaking on his own account, Marvelous still would admit to no interest in the, quote, meaning of meaning, end quote. Purpose is not a scientific concern, he would insist. You see those stars up there? There is no reason for me to question their purpose or to speculate on their meaning. The age, position, size, velocity, distance from the Earth, and chemical composition is the only information I desire about a star. Any additional data are destined to be vague and hesitating in comparison. When I learn what an object consists of and how it behaves, my curiosity about that object has very largely been satisfied. Yes, Marx purported himself to be an objective man in an objective environment. He liked to assume that of all the billions of aspects of our total experience, only those aspects that inform us about the quantitative properties of material phenomena are concerned with the, quote, real, end quote, world. He did believe, however, that man's, mostly illusory, sense of religion had a material counterpart. It was this belief and his desire to acquaint himself with the quantitative laws of religious phenomena that had in fact led him to the roadside zoo where, as materialistic as his attitude toward stars might be, he did not hesitate to enter verbatim in his notebook Amanda's assertion. Stars are merely projections of the human psyche. They are pimples of consciousness, but they are at the same time quite real. It is possible that Marvelous also recorded Amanda's thoughts on style. Maybe I'm attracted to style because the notion of content is a very difficult notion for me to comprehend, said she, patting dough into loaves. When you subtract from an object the qualities it possesses, what do you have left? After you have taken from a star its age, position, size, velocity, distance from Earth, and chemical composition, are you left with a hole in the sky or something other? This lump of dough on the table has the properties of being soft, pliable, white, moist, smooth, and cool to the touch. But what is it exactly? What is the thing, the content, that possesses these qualities? It can't be defined. I'm afraid that the notion of content has to be replaced by the notion of style. She paused to brush back a curl, leaving in the act a gull of flour on her cheek. But then I'm just reciting the voices, you know, the way the robot kids recite their catechism, the way a river recites the graduation of its bed, the way a farter recites his starch. Amen to the last, said Marx Marvelous. Amen and amen again. It must have occurred to your voices that content places limitations on style. In fact, determines style. You believe in astrology. You contend that the color, light, magnetic pulsations of celestial bodies affect us to the extent of shaping our basic personalities. I say that's bull hockey because the total electrical output of the human body is about 1/2000th of a volt, hardly enough to force to be acted upon by planetary or stellar magnetism. But whether you favor astrology or a more rational concept such as genetics or behavioristic psychology, you must admit to a certain predetermining of our lives. Content is there before we are even consciously aware of it. It is all we have to work with, and what that amounts to is that style merely an expression of content. Tell me I'm right, and I'll get out front and get ready to sell those sausages. Say, you're sure lovely with flour on your face. You look like Julia Child of the Spirits. As she assigned her loaves to their stations in the oven, Amanda once more sighed. I'm not going to choose between astrology and genetics because I fail to see any contradiction. The influences on the human animal are too complex and too paradoxical to be explained in terms of any one particular branch of knowledge. When I was 12 years old, I watched a spider drink water. You think that didn't change my life? In the rinsing of her mixing bowl, her hands played like a line of dolphins. These folks who are concerned with freedom, real freedom, not the freedom to say shit in public or to criticize their leaders or worship God in the church of their choice, but the freedom to be free of languages and leaders and gods, well, they must use style to alter content. If our style is masterful, if it is fluid and at the same time complete, then we can recreate ourselves, or rather, we can recreate the infinite goof within us. We can live on top of content, float above the predictable responses, social programming, and hereditary circuitry, letting the bits of color and electricity and light filter up to us, where we may incorporate them at will into our actions. That's what the voices said. They said that content is what a man harbors but does not parade. And I love a parade. She nibbled a petal of batter from the curve of her wooden spoon. By the way, Marx, when you're eating your bread tonight, would you mind keeping an alert out for my pre-Columbian rock crystal skull ring? I do believe I dropped it in the dough. I understand that you believe in cellular memory, said Marx Marvelous, that you think that a record of everything that has ever happened, including the secret, most inner workings of the universe, is stored inside each human being's cells, and that under certain conditions you can browse in this cellular depository as in a library. Oh, bother, he was at it again. It was a mindful afternoon and the clouds were breaking. The sun, like a winning ace up the gray coat sleeve of Skagit summer, had been played with a sudden flourish. Amanda sat in the fir needles of the grove, eating a tomato and avocado sandwich, helping to rake in the chips. With some effort, she smiled sweetly at Marx's latest confrontation. The ragged lips of her sandwich smiled with her. Marx took her silence as an admission of guilt. I can appreciate how you might have jumped to those conclusions, blah, blah, blah. Jung's theory of racial memory and collective unconscious, blah, blah, blah. Drug-induced rememberings of experiences which you could not possibly have had in this lifetime, blah, blah, blah. Migratory habits of insects and birds, blah, blah, blah. The stories primitive man told around the campfire, myths so complex, so multi-leveled, so insightful and symbolically revealing that no atavistic mind could possibly have made them up, blah, blah. I frankly cannot explain how human or animal intelligence has access to such material. Perhaps a form of memory is indeed involved. But I'll tell you this, Amanda, it is not any so-called cellular memory, nor is it a part of the genetic process. Memory is a kind of phenomenon different from the retention of genetic information. Memory is an electrical phenomenon. Its impulses can be measured by instruments. The DNA genetic information process, on the other hand, is a chemical phenomenon. You need only consider the difference in an electrical reaction and a pure chemical reaction to see what a sloppy analogy you've made. Both the memory bank and DNA retain information, that's true. Both your Jeep and my wristwatch have wheels and mechanical workings. But you can't drive my wristwatch to town, blah, blah, blah. Amanda just grinned at this wonderful logic. Her sandwich had nothing left to grin about. But nearly normal Jimmy would not have stood for it. He would have countered Marvelous's cool argument with words of fire. John Paul Ziller and even plucky Purcell might have argued with him, also for Marx's chagrin. Jimmy, who possessed the best instincts of capitalism, Ziller an ultimate artist, and Purcell a social activist at heart, all shared that tragic leaning toward the non-objective and irrational shadows of life. Tragic was Marvelous's word for it. Who would know better than he how tragic it truly was? Hadn't he had to fight his entire adult life against similar impulses? Hell, he could have wallowed in the transcendent, could have broadcast magical visions out of both blue eyeballs if he had weakened and given in to his primitive stirrings. But he held firm. He knew that man's potential on earth, his security and survival, lay in the proper exercise of reason. There were technological solutions to all of life's challenges, if only scientific reason was permitted to provide them. It had been impressed upon Marx at the university and in the think tank the importance of resisting regressive cultural tendencies. Resist them he was prepared to do, even though he must suffer some in resistance. The angel of the bazaar he wrestled nightly into submission, though he often lost the first two falls. He wore the stains of the, quote, dream world, end quote, as shamefully as a guilty smoker wears the yellow on his digits. I understand further, continued Marvelous, that you believe there is no difference between the external and the internal. Well, not only is there a difference, I'll have you know that it is that difference that makes life possible. He launched into an explanation, and, as if in retaliation, the sun card slipped back up the coat sleeve of sky. On and on he went, blah, blah. But when he noticed Amanda singing to a newly found cocoon, he began to suspect that she was paying him no attention. When the cocoon opened and a small butterfly wobbled out, he was sure of it. There was one thing that might shut Marx Marvelous up, and Amanda realized that she must quit postponing it. Alas, however, she could not bring it off. I'm sorry, Marx Marvelous, but I can't fuck you. It was 10 o'clock at night. Amanda was dressed in a silken lavender tunic upon which had been embroidered scenes from the biography of the Queen who chased butterflies while awaiting death. Amanda stood in the doorway of Marks's garage apartment. Her long lashes twitched, fluttered, and jerked again, as if they were a pair of feather dusters being machine-gunned against an igloo, and then they dropped elegantly, tugging her lids half the distance over the curve of her eyeballs. You undoubtedly believe that I've been leading you on, but the truth is, I've discussed it several times with John Paul, and we have decided that it would not be wise. You're an attractive man, and I'd like to, but it would not be smart. Marvelous, who wore only the trousers to his checkered suit, pulled nervously at a hair on his chest. So, he said with some bitterness, your liberated husband does care if you go to bed with other men. Archimedes, who discovered the principle of the lever, once said, give me a place to stand on and I could move the world. Archimedes could have stood on Marx's lower lip. No, that is not the case. As long as it's done with honesty and grace, John Paul doesn't mind if I go to bed with other men, or with other girls, as is sometimes my fancy. Her smile was the pride of Botticelli's cherubs. Then why the hell did you get married? What has marriage got to do with it? I married John Paul because I'm knocked out by his style, because I love him and respect him and enjoy the transformations that take place as a result of our sharing the same dimensions. But Marx, marriage is not a synonym for monogamy any more than monogamy is a synonym for ideal love. To live lightly on the earth, lovers and families must be more flexible and relaxed. The ritual of sex releases its magic inside or outside the marital bond. I approach that ritual with as much humility as possible and perform it whenever it seems appropriate. As for John Paul and me, a strange spurt of semen is not going to wash our love away. Then why do you deny me? Whined Marx. He stared at the floor. Amanda closed the door and moved closer to him. She kissed his cheek. Marx, she said tenderly, you are as sensitive as you are stubborn, and you're, well, shall we say, terribly impressionable. Also, you tend to be possessive. Those are basic characteristics of Cancerians. I know you have no use for astrology, but you can't deny that those are your traits. And neither John Paul nor I feel that you could handle a simple, free relationship with me. No sooner would we begin than you'd be in love with me, which is beautiful, except that you'd make it so complex. You demand more of me. You'd be possessive and play ego games. You'd be jealous of John Paul. Before long, you would create tension between all three of us. Then where would you be? Friction at the Captain Kendrick. No, I just don't think you're ready. Marx Marvelous slowly, desperately, sank to his knees. He embraced Amanda's legs. He buried his head in her perfumed tunic in her crotch. His body shuddered. He sobbed against her pelvis. He whimpered. He clung to her tightly, perhaps ashamed now to let go. For a while, Amanda stood absolutely still. Then she began to caress his fine, sandy strands, her fingers twisting his hair in phantom knots. He relaxed a bit. He kissed her through the fabric. Amanda, if you're leaving, you'd better leave now. Gradually, like the falling of leaves or the bursting of buds or the other so gradual as to be nearly imperceptible dramas of nature, she pulled up her tunic and slipped her panties down around her calves. When the parachute of love descended, Marx Marvelous was face to face with her enchanted gypsy snatch. So quietly did Amanda stand that a whole Skagit Valley, animate and inanimate, from the Cascades to the Sound, seemed on the point of standing quietly with her while he kissed and nibbled her about the groin. His tongue made a few exploratory licks, as if he were a child testing the flavor of a lollipop. She grew impatient and thrust her pubis toward him, and then. His tongue curled and thrust inside of her. His mouth mashed against her. The tip of his nose glistened with her juices. And then. Into the sucking of her when all the befuddlement, all the rage, all the immense, crazy, consuming, speechless frustration of his ineffectual genius. He laughed up the sweet darkness, his tongue drum-rolled against her clitoris. He sucked his way toward the plum of her womb. And then, her orgasm spanned a career that began with a delicate shudder and ended nearly 2 minutes later, his face against her all the while, with a volcanic gypsy moan. At first she came gently, as a moth might. Then, losing control, she writhed and wallowed in hot cat spasms of crude delight. He thought she would never stop. She feared she would dissolve. Her nectars wet his neck and her thighs. Her clitoris was a ladyfinger cloud pump. And she groaned with animal dignity as it throbbed, pumped its fishy billows, its honey and sparks. It was the greatest of the imperfect ventriloquist acts. When his lips moved, her body sang. After Amanda's pulsations had subsided, she wiped off Marx's face with the hem of her tunic. She pulled up her panties and hugged him goodbye. She was dizzy and ready for sleep. He had come to, and he never wore those checkered trousers again. At 3:25, on the afternoon of Thursday, August 6, Marx Marvelous was busy drowning. The Skagit River closed around his lungs like a wedding ring. The Skagit River, which bangs down from the high Cascades, which spills through the wild hills, which is cold and green and silty, and, at this time of year, teeming with salmon spawn, which flows sullenly through the croplands as if pouting about the loss of speed, flowing daily, flowing as it did last year, flowing as it did when the 3 painted duck-hunting chiefs of the tribal Skagit rode upon it in their long canoes, flowing fearlessly into the future, flowing forever from beginning to end. The Skagit River did not give one watery damn that it was drowning the life of Marx Marvelous, promising, if confused, young scientist who had excelled at Johns Hopkins University and once owned a natty checkered suit. First, Marx Marvelous did not like drowning. The water in his lungs was heavy and unnatural. He thought of a cake his father once had baked for his mother's birthday. He felt as if that cake were in his lungs, but drowning is like anything else. You get used to it. It was a relief to quit struggling. When he struggled, his lungs felt overheated and rusted out, like the muffler on an old Ford truck in which he had delivered the Baltimore Sun after he grew too big for his bicycle. That passed. When he ceased to struggle, his lungs ceased to backfire. It was peaceful. Would they publish his dead picture in the Baltimore Sun? Drowning takes a long time. It is not something one does in a fast minute. Don't think it is. There is time to think. There is time to eat a sandwich while drowning. Marx Marvelous would have enjoyed a grilled ham and cheese. Hold the pickles. A light followed Marx Marvelous down the river bottom. He did not know from whence it came. Perhaps the fishes are familiar with this light. Marx Marvelous stared into the light. It is possible to drown with one's eyes open, you know. The face of Albert Einstein appeared in the light. Einstein was demonstrating that since motion depends upon the observer, no one point can be considered the zero of motions. Einstein's face, baggy beneath the eyes, was very kind. Nevertheless, it made Marx Marvelous nervous. He soon replaced it with the face of something we all know and love. Marx Marvelous and the face hung in the water as if the river were a museum, and they were famous pictures placed opposite one another for contrast. The light dimmed. Our gallery is closing for the day, thought Marvelous. One witness who saw John Paul Ziller dive off the Conway South Fork Bridge said it reminded him of the Tarzan movies when Johnny Weissmuller would dive in to save Jane and Boy from the crocodiles. 2 other witnesses agreed. It was the loincloth, they said. The remaining witness, a Swinomish Indian boy, said it reminded him of a movie too. He did not say which one. It was sure no movie when he pulled that feller out of the water, admitted the first witness. His face was purple, Solid purple. I thought for sure he was gone. I was surprised when they got him to breathing again. Did you see that girl? Her inner tube overturned, too, but she swam to shore okay. She kept calling, Marks, Marks. Then that hairy guy dove off the bridge. Man, that's a long way down. It was like a movie. Marks Marvelous regained consciousness. His chest ached. He felt sick. He couldn't hear the music anymore, nor see the light. What for an instant he thought was the light proved to be the great rosy buttocks of Monkol Baboon. The baboon was bowing to the crowd that had gathered. Each time he bowed, his butt ascended like a flaming sun, and when he straightened, the sun set. So the day dawned and ended, over and over again with only a soft sound in between, like Magritte's bowler hat rolling upon a Belgian carpet. Time passed quickly by Moncol's rectal reckoning. It was all okay. Marks Marvelous is going to break the genius machine when he grows up. That's what everyone said. He hasn't, of course. As yet, he hasn't put a strain on it. The leader, with his training in psychology via novels, films, TV, and Landers, etc., knows why. Our sandy-haired young thinker is desperately searching for something in which to believe. Isn't he? As a child, he was too sensitive and too bright to be attached to his family's Baptist fundamentalism for very long. He turned to science almost as a substitute. How cool it was in comparison. How clean and cogent. But that didn't last. With his understanding of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, he began to realize that every system that science proposed was a product of human imagination and had to be accepted with a faith nearly as blind as the religious beliefs which he had jettisoned. Much scientific truth proved to be as hypothetical as poetic allegory. The relationship of those rod-connected blue and red balls to an actual atomic structure was about the same as the relationship of Christianity to the fish or the lamb. What now, dear Marvelous? A fresh examination of traditional religion found it as deficient in function as in creative energy? The wildest scientific postulates seem sound and alive in comparison. Paradoxically, his investigations in pure science, in abstract mathematics and theoretical physics, frequently led him into areas of thought which he could only describe as, well, say it, Marx, metaphysical. How could that be? The mental processes of religion and pure science may be similar, but the ends are different. It is not the purpose of science to make a man feel whole, to produce a kind of exalted happiness. Why not? It is a pity that Marks Marvelous should amplify that peculiarly Western quarrel of science and religion. But he was so terribly ambivalent. Thrashing about within him were two of the major and vital quests of the human spirit, the search for fact and the search for value. Why did the facts he pursued prove so impoverished in value? Why were the value systems he examined so contrary to fact? Could mysticism help him? Various sources informed him that in the life system known as mysticism there was an harmonium of fact and value, but Marvelous recoiled from mysticism with immediate distaste. Mysticism was so corny, so adolescent, so cluttered with dusty and discredited modes of thought, so clouded with woolly abstractions. No good. No good. He clung to science as a wino clings to a door jamb. But the deep division within kept spreading its cheeks. Compounding the spread was yet another side of his personality, the side that had a tooth for the whimsical and outlandish, the side that rutted in him like a lewd and unpredictable springtime compared to the stolid autumn that had settled upon his more public self. The less said about that side, the better. Students of Kepler do not stress his lifelong belief in fairies any more than biographers of Benjamin Franklin dwell upon his illegitimate children, his venereal disease. Pass. After a few months at the Zillers' roadside zoo, however, our boy betrayed a change. Gradually, Marvelous ceased to challenge his employers on every intellectual ground where he suspected them vulnerable. Slowly, even painfully, he fell in step with the rhythms that prevailed at the zoo. In his notebook, he himself transcribed the mood at the zoo as one of, quote, intensity within tranquility, end quote. By then, he probably meant that the Zillers generated an atmosphere of rest and harmony through which coursed currents of unnameable excitement as veins run through meat. Marvelous could relax without fear of apathy. If he did not penetrate the mysterious activities that transpired behind the scenes at the Roadhouse, he did at least share in the air of adventure that surrounded them. If he did not abandon his own attempts to isolate the psychic ember that would flame into the next religious phase, he did relieve the mission of some of its urgency. Following his tasty liaison with Amanda, how like the wilderness she was flavored, there had been a perceptible easing of strain. He became calmly fatalistic about his desire for her. I want to roll in the hay with Amanda. I wish the sun would shine for 2 days in a row. These remarks he made with equal emphasis. Following his rescue from the river by John Paul, he smiled more often at the magician and the magician at him. The three of them became closer friends. Marks gave his checkered suit to the Salvation Army. He let his hair grow long, although he still shaved each morning upon rising. At his baboon nap trial in Seattle, his lawyers wangled a suspended sentence. He developed a tolerance for wild mushrooms and wild music, morels, chanterelles, shaggy lepiotas, the hoodoo meat bucket, the Beatles, Roland Kirk. His hemorrhoids even disappeared. Ah, sigh. By the middle of September, Marks was secure enough in his new station in life to risk a small vacation. Sure, why not? Tourist season had petered out. The zoo was in fit condition. Might put things in clearer perspective if he got away for a while. Reportedly, a lot of strange things were erupting down around San Francisco. Events with religious undertones that might bear looking into. Besides, though life at the roadside zoo was anything but dull, how long had it been since he'd been out on the town, picked up by a broad in a nightclub, drank a double martini on the rocks? Too long, you bet. John Paul lent him a musician's card that would get him in free to any number of dives. Amanda gave him a scarab for luck and a wet kiss for the joy that was in it. Mon Cole waved goodbye at the airport, and baby Thor cried to see him go. Marvelous almost cried himself. But what the hell? He wasn't going away forever. Very soon he consoled himself. He'd be back at the Captain Hendrick, and things would be as they were before, only better. As it happened, however, that was not quite the case. When 2 weeks later he returned to the zoo, Amanda was in bed with Plucky Purcell and Jesus Christ was locked in the pantry.